If you're just joining us, thanks for joining the first League webinar on the changes to our elections in this pandemic and what we can be doing to make sure that all voters are still going to be able to participate in our elections. We're going to get started now. We are so happy to be able to connect with you even in this difficult time. And we know that there are a lot of questions and uncertainty, as with every piece of our lives that have been upended. There are a lot of people who are going through really difficult times because of COVID-19. And even in the midst of this crisis, our elections remain really important, and especially important to make sure that people who are struggling right now can still have their voices heard. So we are going to talk today about some of the national landscape and how Maine will be able to play a part and what our local elections are going to look like. My name's Anna Keller. I'm the Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Maine. And I'm going to be joined today by a number of our staff and volunteer leaders who will talk about different aspects of the election. We are planning on doing this webinar every Wednesday at this time as new news breaks. This will be a place for you to come hear the updates and get questions answered. We'll have a different focus each week on some of the different aspects of our work and the challenges to our democracy, but we'll always have a section on breaking news. You can also get news from us in our Monday action alert email that is going out. So make sure that you are on the League of Women Voters Maine mailing list. We will be sending out a Monday morning update with all of the latest developments, and you can also go to our website and see the address there for lwvme.org/COVID and elections. We are posting all the answers to frequently asked questions there on the website as well. But we will dive into our main topic for today. So we'll go ahead to our agenda here. Can I get the next slide? Great. So we will be talking about the status of our primary and general elections, what we would mean for those to move, is that possible, what's going on at the national level and the federal response around elections. We'll then look at what Maine's response should look like. And Penelope Hamblin is going to talk us through expanding absentee voting, what it would look like for Maine to have an online voter registration option, and how we can make sure that polling places are still available and safe for people who need to go vote in person. And then we will wrap up with action steps for you to take from home and some simple things that we all can do to make our elections work better this year. We'll have pauses between each section to take some questions. As a reminder, we have all attendees on mute. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A section of the that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. You can type your question in there, and we will make sure that you get your question either answered on the air, or if we don't reach everyone, we will follow up. And we want to make sure that you have a chance to get the information that you need from this. We are also going to be recording this webinar. It's going to be archived on the League website after the fact. And so if you want to go back and look at it later or share it with a friend, it will be there to see as well, but to be have you be informed that you are, this is being recorded. Great. So with that and the introduction out of the way, I'm going to hand it over to John Brodegam, who is our Legal and Policy Counsel at the League of Women Voters of Maine and an expert in election law, to talk us through what we know now about the June and November elections. Thanks, John.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. A lot of the state's business has been suspended because of the crisis, but certain things must go forward. And our elections and the election process and the process of registering to vote is one of the things that has to go forward in one way, shape, or form. We've heard yesterday, and it's not yet official as far as I know, that the governor will be delaying the June 9th election for the primary election until at least July 14th. And the governor and the Secretary of State and others in Augusta have been discussing this for a few days now. And we've been engaged in trying to provide our best advice on steps that can be taken to make sure that this election unfolds safely. And yet we have a full voter participation, full voter access to the ballot and to the voting place in a way that's consistent with our strong tradition of voter turnout in Maine. Next slide. This is the November election is set in our state constitution. And the backdrop to these decisions about the COVID crisis in Maine is the legal framework, which starts with the Constitution, which gives the governor a lot of powers, and then some statutes that give the governor even additional specific emergency powers to suspend the enforcement of any state statute or rule that governs how state business is conducted, and that includes the elections. And the governor on March 15th did issue a proclamation invoking those emergency powers and including provisions relating to the ability to conduct elections, so that the conduct of our elections is now under the governor's emergency powers and has been the subject of discussions with the legislature. But the November election is set by the Constitution. And so far it's been our view that the November election can't be moved. It is set for November 3rd. And of course it is a national election as well, which would make postponing it or changing the date even more complicated. So we believe that day will be firm, even while the June primary will probably be moved. Next slide. And as noted, the governor did use that emergency declaration power. The declaration that the governor has proclaimed is limited in duration, but it can be renewed periodically by the governor and in conjunction with the legislature. Measures that can be specifically renewed include all of the budgetary work that has to be done, provisions relating to schools and children's school attendance, and of course provisions relating to healthcare and all of the powers necessary to respond through the CDC and other centers to the coronavirus crisis. So all of those powers are on the table, have been invoked by the governor, and there's a consensus in Augusta around that. Okay, next slide. The federal government's CARES Act in response to the coronavirus crisis included a provision with $400 million in funding for the states to help make sure that elections are secure and smoothly run throughout this year, including any primaries and including, of course, the national general election in November. The original amount sought was much more than $400 million. That's really not a lot of funding that can go to these purposes for when you consider the number of states and jurisdictions that are needed to implement the elections. So there is a possibility additional funding might be coming through, but right now that $400 million is what's available to all of the states to ensure that this unusual election is conducted in accordance with our values and our procedures. Next slide, please. Maine's share of that allocation is 3.29 million. We have been working to advise the state government on measures that can be used, including enhanced absentee voting, which we'll talk about in a moment, and various measures to make sure the voting places are secure and safe for both workers and for people going there to vote. Okay, so I think I'll pass it off to Penelope at this point.
Okay, thanks, and hi, everybody. As we heard from John, the governor and the Secretary of State are discussing what to do about the primary, and as we found out yesterday, they're not exactly on the same page yet. The governor said it's likely the primary will be postponed till July 14th, but that has not been officially announced. That absentee voting is going to be expanded to the maximum degree possible. Meanwhile, the Secretary of State said his preference would be to have the election conducted entirely by absentee voting. They are hashing this out, and hopefully we can look forward to some kind of announcement about this before very long. Next slide, please. So whatever they decide, the primary is going to be largely a vote by mail election. There already are a few states out west that have all mail elections in which every registered voter gets an absentee ballot automatically before every election. Oregon was the leader in this, and that's not something that's going to be happening in Maine. Here you have to request an absentee ballot before every election. That's the current law. But the basic process of absentee voting is similar everywhere, and many of you have voted absentee. You get a ballot in the mail a few weeks before Election Day, you mark it, and you put it in a security sleeve, and you sign it, and that's very important that you sign it. And return it by mail, in person, or in some states, you can return it in a secure drop box. The signature on the ballot has to match a signature that's already on file, or that ballot may be rejected. The ballot has to be received by Election Day, so if it's delivered late in the mail, the ballot doesn't count. And these are some reasons why we're looking for some more flexibility, and why the League and other stakeholder groups are hoping we'll be able to keep an option for some safe voting in person in the primary. We don't want to disenfranchise people who need help voting, or who have unreliable mail service, or who miss the mail-in voter registration deadline, which is 21 days before the election. As you have seen, if you're following the news, voting by mail has become a huge partisan issue leading up to yesterday's disaster in Wisconsin. The Republican Party sued to prevent the governor from postponing the primary. He wanted to postpone it because the clerks were so overwhelmed with absentee ballots that they had not even mailed some of them out. And this obviously should not be a partisan issue. Here in Maine, we just have to keep Wisconsin as a prime example of how not to conduct an election during a pandemic. And next slide, please. We're in pretty good shape here in Maine that we do have the infrastructure for absentee voting. For 20 years, we've had what's called no excuse absentee voting, which means anyone can request an absentee ballot. You don't have to have an excuse or a reason. And in most recent elections, about 30% of the votes were absentee. So the clerks are familiar and comfortable with the process, obviously not with the scale that we're going to be seeing in the primary vote. Next slide, please. So the League and a group of stakeholders around the state have come up with a set of specific asks. John mentioned some of them that we're taking to the Secretary of State that we want to see put in place to keep this election what it should be. If at all possible, we're looking to maintain some safe in-person voting. We'd like to see absentee ballot requests mailed to all registered voters. People may not be able to print them out off the web at home because they may not have access to a printer. We'd also like to see prepaid postage because, again, people may not have a stamp and not be able to go out for a stamp. We'd like to extend the deadlines currently set in law for when absentee ballots can start being counted before Election Day, and also to extend to 2 days after the election the deadline for getting them returned. And we'd like to see some of the money being provided by the feds to provide more staffing and help for cities and towns as they try to deal with this. Next slide. We'd also like to see some flexibility in voter registration. Again, right now, if you want to mail in your voter registration application, it has to, the deadline is 21 days before Election Day. We're asking that, at least for this election, people be allowed to submit, for example, digital copies of their driver's license, since they may not have access to a printer to qualify for voting. And this is hugely important. We need a massive effort in communication. Maine has more than 500 different municipalities administering elections. We have seen a history of some of these not providing accurate information. This hasn't been one of Maine's strongest points in elections, and we have to be sure that confusion or misinformation don't cost people their chance to vote. Any questions before we continue? Okay.
We do have a couple of questions that have come in via the chat box.
Wonderful.
So I'm going to repeat those out. The first one is, how is the voter signature validated? Is it done by human eyes or digitally?
Yes, it's done by humans. There are in some places artificial intelligence or other mechanical methods of doing it, but here the clerk looks, or whoever's processing, and looks at what's on file in the voter registration card, and looks at the ballot and decides if they agree. So it's a pretty human process right now.
Do you know how often signatures are questioned?
I believe we had numbers for how many ballots were rejected because of bad signatures. It's in all about 1% of absentee ballots are rejected. I think there are probably, there's a low percentage where they're found to be wanting, and often the clerk will try to get in touch with the voter and give them an opportunity to correct that.
We still have more. I want to say a lot of people are sending in questions right now. If you can use the Q&A portion rather than the chat, that will make it a little easier to make sure your question doesn't get lost. And also, this is Evan, by the way. I'm just doing a little support for this webinar. I'm going to try to save any that are more general questions for the end, and things focused so that people are really only answering things about what they were just saying. Because you have a lot of very good questions. Somebody asked what the deadline is before an election for requesting an absentee ballot.
You can request one in person up to the Thursday before the election if you want a no excuse absentee ballot. If you have an excuse currently, you can request one right up to Election Day.
Have there been thoughts on how homeless people and those without addresses will get ballots?
Right, yes. And that's one of the big issues about having something completely by mail. We need some option for people who don't have reliable mail.
So thank you. For the rest of you, would volunteers be used to help with mailing, counting, etc.? Somebody has asked that.
That's a great question, and probably something that's going to be worked out. Election workers are paid. They're not volunteers, and I don't know if anyone would want to propose that or not. I haven't heard anything about it. There's been talk of getting younger people to do it, but again, there's some issues with that as well.
All right. It looks like the rest of the questions I'm seeing are a little bit more general. And The presenter right then was Penelope, the person who just asked that, Penelope Hamblin.
So are we ready to move on to the next section, which is, okay, you've heard what we'd like to see done, what might be done, and what can you do?
I believe we are. So, hi everyone, I'm Evan Tess-Murray. Sorry for the hiccups. I'm attempting to monitor the Q&A while also talking to you all. We have a few links here and we will send out this so that you'll be able to take a look at them and click on them to make it a little bit easier for you to request your own absentee ballot and get that filled out and sent in. Was somebody going to talk about the fact that this is a closed primary? That can be me. Because you have to enroll in a primary, it's important that when you're requesting your absentee ballot, you know which party you're enrolled in. In some states, that's less of a problem because party enrollment is something that most people are enrolled in one of the two major parties. In Maine, we actually have a lot of unenrolled people and folks whose party enrollment might change over time. So if you're requesting your absentee ballot, we strongly suggest that you check on your voter registration in advance so that you know which party you're enrolled in and you get the correct ballot. You have to be enrolled in a party to participate in the primary for that party. Maine's support for mail-in voter registration is a little bit, it's not the way, in Maine we have a long history of doing things face-to-face. And unfortunately right now that's not the safest way to do things. So this is the link to, and you can certainly just look this up at eac.gov, the National Mail Voter Registration Form, which you can print off yourself and send in. And you can mail that in order to register to vote. So if you're not already registered, getting registered to vote in Maine is a little bit more complicated than requesting an absentee ballot. You can also use this form if you need to change your address or update your party enrollment. If you're registering for the first time, there are requirements that you also send proof of ID and proof of address, proof of residence. There's a lot of detail about what that means. But right now in Maine, that means that you would send them like a photocopy of your license and a piece of mail or something along those lines. This is a pretty clunky system and we're not trying to say that it's not. So we are actually trying to find ways to streamline this or make it more possible for people to easily register by mail. Normally we'd be saying you could register by mail, you can bring identification with you the first time that you vote, for example. But if we're trying to vote by absentee, then that doesn't work quite as well. Some of you have probably seen this before. This is what the voter registration card looks like in Maine. You can go to the Maine Secretary of State's website and request a card. You can call your town clerk and request them to send you one. Or you can print one, like print a version of it from what the Secretary of State provides and fill it out. And these are the bits that you have to make sure that you fill out completely. And again, if you register for the first time, there's application instructions on what else you have to provide. So when we say, how can you help right now? We want folks to be double checking your voter registration and party enrollment. So I did that this morning because I wanted to make sure that I was registered, that I knew what party I was enrolled in. In my case, I called my town clerk, they answered the phone, they answered my questions, and it took 30 seconds. We have a few concerns that some towns, their clerks are working from home or not working much. They might have limited hours right now. And so if this is something that it's just a good idea to give a call and see sooner rather than later. And as we've been mentioning, one thing you can do is request your absentee ballot. Again, sooner is good rather than later. And we haven't mentioned it so far, but it is census time. And the census is something that is deeply important in how we get political representation. So we're trying to put in a pitch. Like right now, if you're sitting there going, what can I do to help? Fill in your census form, be counted. You will have already gotten it in the mail, gotten a reminder postcard if you haven't already done it, and you can fill it out at 2020census.gov. If you got the form in the mail, it's like a very forbidding packet, but it's just because they give you enough pieces of paper for 8 different people in your household to fill it out. And so it looks like a lot more work than it is. It's pretty straightforward. And please check in with friends and family to make sure that they are also ready to vote and ready to be counted for the census. Especially when things are so up in the air, we know we want as many people as possible engaged in this upcoming election. So we want people to be taking those steps to make sure that your vote will be counted. And then I want to turn this over to Will, our advocacy coordinator, to talk a little bit about about one other thing you could be doing.
Hi everyone. So one other thing you can be doing is helping out with the Maine Clean Elections. So the Maine Clean Elections Act allows a candidate who enrolls in the program to receive public financing for their campaigns after receiving a minimum number of $5 qualifying contributions from voters in their district. The current deadline for receiving that minimum number of contributions is April 21st. And with the inability of candidates to do any sort of in-person contact with voters in their district, we've heard from a number of candidates that they're having trouble meeting the required minimum of qualifying contributions. So we would encourage you to go on the Maine Clean Elections Act contributions website, and there you can enter in your voting information and see if you have any qualifying, if you have any clean elections candidates in your district. From this page, you can consider making contributions to any or all of these candidates to help them qualify for clean elections funding before the April 21st deadline. And I will hand it back to Evan to discuss Vote 411.
Yes, so I am our Education and Engagements Project Manager, and that means that I'm one of the folks who works on our voter guide. And while we will still absolutely be doing print voter guides as appropriate, we're making use of an online interactive voter guide called vote411.org, provided by the League of Women Voters nationally. And we're very excited that this year we're going to be able to cover every race in Maine throughout 2020. So not just the state level stuff, not just our federal level stuff, but actually we can do down to the municipality. If we can get the information, we can get it into the online system, we can make it available through this resource for people. And the only real limitation on how much we're able to collect that information is how many people we have to help us do that research. So if you're somebody who's sitting there going, I do want to be more involved, and I would really like to be able to find a way to help right now from my own home, I'm taking your own town, the towns around it, and just see if we can get a comprehensive voter guide, not just for July, but for the rest of the year moving forward for the state of Maine. This is one of those ways that people can be useful in a concrete way that can be a small amount of work or a large one, depending on how much time you have to give. And that we're pretty excited about being able to tell people, even in the farthest corners of Maine, that their towns matter too. So that's my pitch for if you want something to do out there, join our 411 team. We have a little information about getting in touch with us, and we also have a lot of questions, so if you'll bear with us for just a second, I'm going to try to figure out the best way to get these answered. I'm going to read them out, and various panelists can answer. The best person to answer that question, I think, is how we're going to do that. So, do we have a plan for communicating accurate information to the various municipalities?
Sure, this is Anna. I can work on that. So we are advocating with the Secretary of State to provide comprehensive information to all the towns. One of the barriers that we've often seen is that towns don't have great information. They're not mandated to post information on their websites about absentee voting, and often they put up incomplete or incorrect information. So what we're looking for is for the Secretary of State to put out full information in easy to digest forms, and give that to the towns and encourage them to use that centralized information. We're also, through the Vote 411 system that Evan was talking about, providing information about what's on the ballot locally, and that's something that we're hoping to be able to do for every town. But it's another thing that you can be doing is looking at your town's website and seeing, do they have good information, and asking them to provide better information and letting us know when you see issues around any of that. We can all be watchdogs for this in our own communities, and the League is happy to be coordinating a response where there are towns that are falling down on that duty, whether it's because their staff is overwhelmed, or they just are not as on the ball with elections.
This kind of ties into the next question. What is the process for holding town clerks accountable? Do they report to the Secretary of State in some way, or is it entirely up to the town manager and their select board?
You want me to take that one?
Yes.
This is John Brott again. Yeah, the town clerks are local officials, and they're responsible to the local government. They do not report to the Secretary of State in Augusta, although there is a lot of back and forth between the Secretary of State as the state's chief elections officer. But the accountability of the clerks themselves is through the local town government.
What types of challenges, litigation, or voter suppression efforts do we anticipate?
Do you want to take that, John?
Well, sure. I think it's a good question. There are very few elections that have ever been held under a situation of emergency authorization of powers like this. I think for the most part, people are united in supporting the governor and the legislature in the way they've handled this process. And going forward, we're hopeful that that will continue. But at the end of an election, there's always somebody who loses, and that person could look back and find a flaw somewhere along the way and try to launch some kind of challenge. I think that's unlikely, and I think it's unlikely it would succeed, but it is possible since it is new ground that we're walking on here.
Before we move on from legal questions, are there legal penalties for misinformation about voting?
No, there are no specific legal penalties to a person on the street who may give misinformation for voting. If there's a systematic attempt to disenfranchise people by providing information that's intended to deny them access to the ballot, and especially if that's being conducted by a public official of some kind, then that could be challenged as a violation of the person's right to vote.
Thank you. We still have quite a few questions. I'm trying to group them by theme. Is the League opposed to the Secretary of State's proposal for the primary? And if so, why?
This is Anna. I'll take that one. We are in support of some parts of his proposal, but have some skepticism about others. So what he's proposed is moving back the June election into July, simplifying the ballot so that only contested primary races would be on the ballot, so that if a candidate was running unopposed, that wouldn't appear, and having only absentee voting and no in-person option. And we're okay with the first two if simplifying the ballot and moving back the election allows us to hold elections where everyone gets to vote. Those are reasonable compromises to make to this emergency situation. But not having any option for people to vote in person does end up disenfranchising some of the most marginalized people in our state. And for people who are going through real instability because of this crisis, not giving them a backup way to vote could really be a problem. So we're looking at it like, if we do a good job of expanding absentee voting and most people in the state vote absentee, there won't be crowds on election day. It'll be much easier for local officials to hold an election that abides by social distancing and is safe for the workers and for the voters, but that there still needs to be that option. And so while we understand the challenges that the Secretary of State and local officials are dealing with, and we certainly don't minimize that it's going to be really hard to do some of this, we also view elections as an essential service, in the same way that people need to be able to get their groceries and get their prescriptions. If voting in person is the only way that they're going to be able to vote, they need to be able to do that as well. So we're going to keep working with the Secretary of State and making that argument, and a lot of other advocacy groups in the state who work with many of the people who could lose their ability to vote if it was an only vote by mail option, are also helping to make those points.
Thank you. We have a bunch of questions focused on communication. So I'm going to kind of group them a little bit and say, there's one that says, was this massive coordinative effort done to educate the public about the new primary? And I'm not sure, I think a better way of saying that in this case, since this is such new news, is just what kind of coordinated effort do we want to see to educate the public about the new primary? And there are also a couple of questions about whether or not the State League could be drafting periodic press releases and if people could help with that.
This is Anna. I'll start, and then I hope that my other panelists can help to fill in about what the communications response might look like. We are looking at what the Secretary of State did around ranked choice voting, as well as community groups like the League, in order to make sure that people understood how to vote with ranked choice voting. There was a video from the Secretary of State that explained it, that went out. He held a series of town halls, which we might not be able to do in person, but he could still use his position to really talk directly to voters. And we're looking at the channel of communication, what the information the Secretary of State has on the department's website, the information that they provide. They could be providing in standardized forms to local election officials. Some of that is just a matter of resources and getting it done. And we want to support them using their federal funding to provide those sort of communication resources. And some things might require some action from the governor under her emergency powers to, for example, mandate that towns post information on their websites, which they're currently mandated to put up posters in polling places with the sample ballots and a few other things around election information, but they're not mandated to do anything digitally. And so that's something where a lot of towns would want to do it, but in order to get real compliance, we might need to have some of that coming top down in this moment. And in terms of what the League can be doing, we put out a press release yesterday with our recommendations. You can see them on our website. These were a set of recommendations that we came to with 12 other organizations around the state, came to a set of consensus recommendations. And those we're going to keep refining and highlighting as we learn more about what this response is going to be looking like. We're going to be zeroing in on the places where we have, particular concerns, or we want to highlight the work that's being done. And so we're planning to continue to do that public education through forums like this, through our emails, and through engagement with the media.
So we have a couple questions about local elections. If the primary is moved to July, what about local elections or referenda that often take place in the same time? Would those be automatically moved, or would it be up to each individual town to decide what to do?
I can try to take that one. It's a good question, and there isn't really a clear answer yet. There are towns that need to have various town meetings and procedures pursuant to their town charters during certain time frames, and we have not yet heard whether or not any of those time frames will be altered by the emergency proclamation or anything that the legislature might do. So the best I can tell you is that it is possible that some of those elections may proceed if a town chooses to do so, unless the state actually orders them not to do it.
Are we expecting the Clean Elections Act qualifying deadline to be extended if we move the election to July?
I can also take that one, I guess. All I can say is that that has been a subject of discussion, but there hasn't been any decision on it yet. In fact, the deadlines are rapidly approaching. So our advice is to assume that the deadlines are not going to be extended until we hear otherwise. Good question.
In light of the mail-in problem, we have a question about other problems with closed primaries, and is there any effort to open Maine's primaries?
I can take that. This is Anna. There are ongoing efforts to open Maine's primaries. I think it's very unlikely that we will see those changes for this upcoming primary, but it's a reason why having open primaries could be, or semi-open primaries where an independent could request a ballot for a party's primary without changing their registration. The ease of doing that through absentee voting without needing to change your registration is an argument in favor of that. We also have seen historically some strong opposition within both of the major parties to that reform. And so I don't expect it in this time, but the League continues to be supportive of having semi-open primaries. And it's something that we're going to be working for in all of our long-term work.
Does anyone know anything about Dr. Shah's position about in-person voting? And if there has been any kind of a response from Maine CDC about how we should be voting?
There hasn't been a response yet. Voting isn't referenced in any of the directives that have come out from the Maine CDC or in any of Governor Mills' orders around what businesses and activities have been curtailed. The way we're looking at it is the same restrictions for essential services in terms of limiting the number of people who can be in a polling place at a time and having distancing and sanitation and all of these things that we're becoming rapidly used to seeing in places like grocery stores, that's what would be needed in order to make polling places be safe. And in order to not have that produce very long lines, we would need to see only people who really have to go vote in person be voting in person. And so part of what everyone can do to ensure that those polling places are safe is to request your absentee ballot and do it, and do it as soon as you can, as long as you feel like you're going to be able to receive mail, be able to send that, get in your absentee ballot request. That way, if there is any issue with your ballot, that you will have ample time to get anything resolved that you might need to resolve. If it turns out you have to change your voter registration, you'll have time to work through that. I requested my absentee ballot online last week. It was really easy. I got a response a couple days later from my town clerk that the request was processed, and when they were going to mail out absentee ballots, I would be getting mine. And that went a long way to, reassuring me about my right to vote. So we're really encouraging that everyone go and do your absentee ballot if you can.
We have a question about, have the people working on signature collections to restrict ranked choice voting been successful? Do we have any more information on that?
I guess I'll answer that one too. What we've been hearing is that they have not gotten the signatures that they need yet. They have been, so some folks in the Republican Party have been urging the governor to keep the elections in June so that they could collect signatures at polling places in June. We have also heard some concern that because the legislature adjourned early, that actually moved up the deadline for those signatures to be collected. And so it's a tough environment for a group trying to do a people's veto. I would not want to be in their shoes at this moment. And I think it's going to be very difficult for them to collect those signatures. I know they're being very creative about trying to find ways to do it, but since the league supports ranked choice voting, I'm not too sympathetic, but as a person who has done a lot of signature collection, I do in some ways feel for the effort that they're having to put in at this point.
Are there any statewide ballot questions for the primary?
I don't believe so. Does anyone have more information about that?
I didn't think so either.
No,
Wasn't certain.
there are none.
The referendum question. Does someone want to say anything about the referendum question that may or may not be on the November ballot while we're on the subject?
Somebody just brought up a bond issue they think might be on, but I haven't heard about it. So
There is a People's Citizen Initiative question regarding the corridor proposal, the utility power line that has been approved in terms of the number of signatures that they gathered. There is some idea that that might be litigated, so we may not have the final word on whether that'll be on the ballot in November, but assuming that the court upholds the signature approval, that would be on the ballot in November.
Just to add, there are two bond issues on the June ballot.
okay, thank you. Is one of the roads and internet bonds?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Thank you, Hugh, for bringing that up because I didn't know about them. Thank you, Will. We have a question about absentee voting. If you get your absentee ballot and fill it out now and then the state moves the elections to July, how would that be handled?
We're still waiting to know for sure what they will do. Our expectation is that the requests will still be valid for the July election, if that is what ends up happening. There is, under normal circumstances, you can start requesting an absentee ballot 3 months before the election, and so the window open for the June election. In the unlikely scenario that they decided that moving to the election to July meant that there was a new 3-month window and we weren't yet in it, I find it unlikely that they would say that people who have already requested their ballots would have to do it again. If that were to be the case, we would be pushing very hard for towns to be contacting all of those voters and notifying them that they had to do it again. But like I said, it would be much easier for them to simply extend that window and say, oh, in this case, because the election moved back, you get 4 months to request your ballot, than it would be to have to make voters do it again.
This is Will. Just to add, also the actual absentee ballots are not mailed out until a month before the election, so we anticipate that we would know what the new date will be far before any sort of mailing of ballots occurs.
We only have a couple more questions left at this point. One, will the league be working with the Maine Town and City Clerk Association to provide good information to the town clerks?
Well, this is John. I'll chime in. Yes, we will be working with the Town and City Clerks Association. They're a great resource. They are present in every town, obviously, and they are very knowledgeable about elections. So we will be working with them to make sure that they have information that we have that we can share with them to help facilitate the election process.
This is a tiny question, I think, but someone really does want to know, is it correct that absentee ballots for state primaries and local elections must be mailed separately? Does anyone know the answer to that?
No, I believe that they are mailed together. Am I?
Cool. And finally, we have somebody asking, pointing out that there are paid signature collectors, and wondering if there's a move to have paid petitioners a certain distance from polling places. And I don't know if this person means just right now because there's a pandemic, or more generally.
Well, the issues around who can stand where in the polling locations have been a subject of discussion for quite a while, over the last year. And that would be part of that conversation. Now, most of that conversation occurred before the pandemic, and how the pandemic changes things remains to be seen. There are constitutional provisions that govern who can stand, who can be excluded from a place like a polling place. But the general principle is that the polling place should be a place where people can vote free from any kind of obstruction or harassment. But yet they still can be a public forum where important issues and organizations that are involved in civic life can have a presence.
Thank you. That is all of the questions that people have currently sent into the Q&A.
Thanks for fielding all of those, Evan, and everyone's great questions. We are going to take a few of those that I'm noticing we don't have information currently up about in our frequently asked questions on our website, and make sure that we post the answers there, because we've come up with some great questions. We are just about out of time for today, but I want to thank you all for tuning in. We are going to be in this same time next week. We will have, forward to the next slide, we are going to be talking about a longstanding project of the League of Women Voters that has some particular importance in this moment. Our report just came out on the state of Maine democracy. This report is letting us examine all different facets of how Maine's democracy and government work, from voter participation and representation through access to the media, money in politics, how disparities like poverty impact our democracy. We have just released this report, and it shows a lot about the strengths of our democracy and about the weaknesses in our system, and those pre-existing weaknesses are exactly the places that we're starting to see the cracks and the struggle under the pressure of this crisis. But some of our strengths, like high voter participation and strong civic culture, are also some of the things that are going to help us get through. So there's your preview of our webinar for next week. We hope that you'll join us April 15th at 12 p.m. The link to register for that webinar is now up on the League website under the events tab. And we will be prefacing that webinar with any updates that we've learned about the June or November election. And we will also be taking your questions about everything relating to elections in this strange time. So please join us next week. Request your absentee ballot, fill out the census, check in with your friends and family if they've done the same, and we welcome your help with providing accurate nonpartisan voter information down to the municipal level. So you can always get in touch with us if you'd like to get involved with any of our work and the Vote 411 project in particular. Thank you to our panelists and for all of you for joining, and we're gonna say goodbye and have a great afternoon.